Data rights activism is something to really think about. With data being the most valuable asset and with consent coming into the conversation, the power of data in the wrong hands can truly change the course of the future. The morbid reality is we are going to grapple with this and standing up to it and making sure that our voices are heard and protecting it for the good is where we should be going. With that, we come to the next session that we have lined up for today, Dial D for Disruption, thriving in a world where everything can be copied. Imitation is the sincerest form of flattery. This next keynote talks about staying ahead of the curve despite the fact that everybody else is copying you. I'm going to welcome on stage Howard Yu, IMD Lego Professor of Management and Innovation, MD Business School, Switzerland. Being the fact that he's a Lego professor, he's also a Lego fan and plays bricks at home. He used to be a banker before he turned academic. He worked with both Citibank and Standard Chartered. Because he was a banker, he was disappointed about the fact that he couldn't innovate in the course of being a banker, so he decided to study it instead. And today's talk is about understanding the knowledge versus doing gap. A lot of visions exist, but a lot of times the execution fails. So how do you tackle that? That's the conversation that we're going to have now. Please put your hands together for Howard. Howard, the stage is all yours.
Thank you. Good morning. It's great to be here. And I remember before I joined IMD in Switzerland almost 8 years ago, I was still at Harvard Business School. And I get obsessed with this question. How come a lot of the time, company would have a well-articulated vision, they know what is coming, they allocate resources accordingly, and yet they fumble in the marketplace? After all, Polaroid, Kodak go down the drain not because they do not have digital technology. They have. They invented the first digital camera, and yet they couldn't exploit the next knowledge frontier and truly capitalize that market opportunities. So I'm always getting obsessed about this knowing and doing gap. Over the last day and a half, I've heard a lot of great vision, and we do emerge with a shared vision as well. Visions such as, we all know now, intangible assets become more and more important than tangible asset. The fact that you own factory equipment matter less, but in fact, it's your IP, it's your brand, it's your know-how that explain the valuation of the company more and more. That seems to be obvious to everyone. Data is the new oil. Algorithm that you build become more and more important. Things that you couldn't put your hands on by traditional accounting method become more and more valuable. It's no secret, everyone knows. Over the last day and a half, again, we heard about how the internet evolved, how algorithm really help supplement and even augment human decision making. And it's no secret anymore that the big opportunity out there for internet kind of dynamic is no longer on the consumer side of the internet, but is aviation, transportation, legal work, finance, energy, utility management. These are conservative settings historically, and yet it opened up new paths for growth for many years to come. So at IMD in Switzerland, we get obsessed to track which company, in fact, can make progress towards that vision, which company, in fact, is simply just keep on talking with no action, putting out a statement, a press release, just to pacify investors, and then they fumble in the marketplace. Let's take automotive as an example. Then I show you some of the research finding in the financial industry, and then we generalize a couple of key lessons learned going forward. I mean, if you think about auto industry, of course these days, everyone obsessed about beyond just electric vehicle is autonomous driving, is using AI and big data analytics into the product level. And so if you're a car guy from Tata Motors to Toyota to BMW, you get confronted with multiple disruption right now. Just like any other industry, you're always confronted with multiple challenge. The fact that your old business is maturing, the fact that you can still sell internal combustion engine, but you know there's a time limit for this core business to thrive. There is the emergence of lightweight material subsidizing or substitute the traditional steel and aluminum, but then 5G is coming. Car will getting connected, it will become entertainment center. How can we play the fact that people no longer want to own car, they just want to have mobility from point A to point B, and the emergence of autonomous driving vehicle. And so how executive and business academic can understand this world, you can always see by 2 by 2, right? The great thing about a 2 by 2 matrix is all you need to make sure you move from quadrant 1 to quadrant 4, and you figure out what the axes are later on. Just kidding. But the fact that you can almost see today's world is quadrant 1. People buying their own car, people still driving their own car. Quadrant 2 would be basically Uber or Grab in turbocharge. That no one is owning their car, but all the cars are shared, but people still driving a car. Quadrant 3 is Tesla autopilot on steroid. People still buy their own car, but car would go by itself. Quadrant 4, the nightmare for Toyota, that the two trends converge. Again, industry after industry, there are nightmarish scenarios that incumbent must confront. For bank executive, it would be fintech on steroid, for instance. For consumer packaged goods company, would be direct to consumer model on steroid. Anyways, who's right, who's wrong? Which scenario would be right? You can make an analysis based on total cost of ownership, right? Very simple. You're looking at the total cost today. Of course, scenario 1 of today is most expensive because most of the cars are sitting in idle in a garage no one uses. Scenario 2 is cheaper because most cars would have a higher utilization rate. Scenario 3, Tesla autopilot on steroid can save a lot of money in terms of total cost of ownership. Why? Because on highway, for instance, you can use technologies like platooning. The car next to each other are very close to harness aerodynamic. The car behind will save fuel. You can use smart city control to make sure there are less congestion, etc. Nightmarish example that I mentioned before, when a two trend converge, it would save a lot of money. Then the million-dollar question becomes, when scenario 4 would happen? The good news is, when question pops up like this, McKinsey always tell you so. So McKinsey's tell us, by 2040, the game is over. Half the car would be essentially self-driving and shared by the population. Notice that in that scenario, 80% mileages driven by the population would belong to those categories. So the implication is the number of cars would get reduced. The implication becomes the industry would get consolidated. We see now today already, right? Car industry is going through consolidation. Huge amount of pressure of getting bigger and bigger because the total amount of cars sold will get reduced. Now, what's really interesting is, despite all these obvious factors, sometimes when I talk to executives among incumbents, they would say things like, Howard, you don't get it. People would always buy a car because driving is fun. I hear about that conversation from an executive in Stuttgart, a car guy. And I looked at him, where were you in the last decades? I'm talking to my friends from the Philippines, in Jakarta, in Indonesia. Driving is never fun. Driving is a chore. Think about the congestion. But for these executives, born in Munich, work in Munich, retired in Munich, it's so hard to see an alternative world. So in the space of change, diverse thinking, cognitive diversity beyond just gender diversity is absolutely key. So at IMD, we measure companies. Which are the car company are actually prepared for the future, which car company is simply giving cheap talk to investor just to pacify the financial market. Here is how we measure. I'll tell you about the methodologies, and then I'll go through some of the analysis, as well as show you some of the findings also in the financial sector as well. For a company to reinvent itself successfully, first is they need to invest ahead of time, meaning before their core business decline, they need to invest in the future. Because once the moment your core business decline, there's no freedom for you to make big investment. Second is, so we measure the profitability of their core business first. But then to make high profit doesn't matter too much unless you invest in the future. So we also measure the R&D expenditure as well. But then we also look at how do your investors see yourself? Is your company a cash cow, or is your company generating new wave of growth? So we take in PE ratio, stock price, holding revenue constant. Then we also looked at, in order for a company to invest the future, the board diversity is important. So we look at LinkedIn, what is the CEO background? What is the C-suite background? Thanks to social media again, doing research is fairly easy these days. And turns out, CEO background matters a lot. When CEO is close to retirement, usually empirically, CEO is not going to embrace a lot of disruptive change because their bonus is on the line, generally speaking. When a CEO first came on board, he or she doesn't have enough credibility to instigate large-scale change as well. So there's an inverted U-curve. Last, we measure new product launch. Supposedly, when a company successfully launches a great product, the press would talk about that. Then you scale. You move to the second market. Then the press would again talk about that, and so on. So we measure, for instance, electric vehicle as industry standard, measure against BMW electric vehicle, measure against Toyota electric vehicle, and see which one is sitting on top of one another. Given these 12 different measures, we roll up to a composite index. And what we've seen is kind of interesting. So this is a survey that we published in the World Economic Forum, sponsored by Credit Suisse. I'll show you the link and you can Google it later on. Now, if you look at these findings, BMW is number 7. It's good, but it's not great. Now, this is worrisome because, again, I told you before, in the auto sector, there's going to be huge amount of consolidation. So you, in fact, need to be a great company to have a prosperous future. So I was surprised by BMW because they were the early one who launched the electric vehicle. Remember when Tesla launched Model S, BMW launched i3, the BMW i brand. Industry loves it. People were saying it's a great car. It's so fun to drive. Then 1 year later, they launched i8, the sports vehicle, a hybrid. Again, industry really loves it. But then there's no news. Now in innovation, no news is very bad news. What happened is, it turns out because the hybrid and the electric vehicle is still making much less money than the traditional main offering. The marketing team being a centralized function, they focus more onto their mainstream offering. So there are less investment in market presence. And then if you're a designer for electric vehicle, you get frustrated, you hate it, you left BMW and you went to Silicon Valley, set up your own store, joined Faraday, joined Tesla. That's exactly what happened. There's a talent exodus away from Munich all the way to California and China as well. So the last CEO who resigned last year from BMW, when he first became the CEO, the first thing he does is to fold BMW i back to the mainstream business in order to save cost. I've seen that movie before. Kodak, before they folded, they decided to integrate the digital camera division back to the mainstream film business in order to save cost. Now, I'm not predicting BMW future, so don't sell their stock because of me. I'm just a messenger. But it goes to show a lot of the time when we try to scale disruption, whether it's Kodak scaling up digital camera, whether it's BMW scaling up EV, it costs so much money that a company could not even self-finance. Paradoxically, from Daimler to BMW, this family business, they were obsessed with 100% control. Compare and contrast General Motors. I was very surprised when the finding comes back because I thought GM has been plagued by bankruptcy. There is no chance for them to survive. But then turns out after the Obama bailout, Mary Barra, the external CEO, who's the first female executive, joined the car company. He brought in new board members from outside to join the company. They invest in a company called Cruise Automation. And then they were successfully to partner with Honda, their arch rival, to launch pizza delivery slated 2020 in Tokyo. But not just that. when SoftBank decided to invest in cruise automation, GM said, yes, please put the money in. We scale back our holding to minority shareholdings. That is the kind of capital agenda unthinkable in a German family business context. And as a result, the latest figures that show companies that invest the most in autonomous driving is led by Waymo of Google. The second player is GM, cruise automation. But GM play it by others people's money. The key lesson learned from automotive is scaling up disruption will always cost you a lot of money. Beyond design thinking and lean startup methodologies, a lot of you are expert in this room. What else is missing? In the auto sector, what's critically missing is a creative capital agenda. And that is a discussion, oftentimes a difficult discussion, cannot get delegated unless the C-suite take on that discussion themselves. So let's take a look in the finance sector. Because today in the finance sector, everyone talk about robo-advisory. Everyone talk about blockchain, mobile service, mobile payment, ecosystem. Again, it's the same vision shared by the entire industry. We use the same methodologies to measure which banks are just talking about that, which banks are actually making tangible progress along the way. From that angle, you would suspect companies that are digital native, such as PayPal, such as Square, they would be sitting on top of my ranking. But I'm not caring too much about this digital native. I get obsessed which are the industry incumbent are successfully ready themselves for the future. And from that angle, we were surprised again that it's actually Master and Visa card are the most interesting fintech startup, if you will, in today's world. So I was surprised because I thought credit card is going to disappear. Plastic will become irrelevant in the future. So we did some deeper analysis to understand why Master and Visa card is even more prepared than PayPal and Square for this instance. And turns out what's interesting, of course, Master and Visa have their own incremental innovations, such as the biometrics as you see on the left top corner. But yet at the same time, PayPal needs to work with Visa and Master to connect with merchant and buyer as well. Even Facebook, before they had this idea of launching their cryptocurrency initiative, which is ill-fated, they had Facebook Credit. They require Visa and Master to clear the infrastructure. So much so from Google Wallet to Apple Pay, they were all using Master and Visa card infrastructure. So here's the key lesson learned. If you cannot beat fintech innovator, you let them join you. And that's the secret sauce for Visa and Master. They totally understand for us to reinvent the next generation of killer app or killer features, it would always be too slow, too late, we're too big. What we could do is to open up our platform, our infrastructure, make it so easy for others to connect, and so secure that even Apple would choose to work with them. This is why last year, when Apple launched its Apple Card, the design is beautiful. It truly is quite stunning from an aesthetic point of view. But at the back of the Apple Card, it still have the MasterCard logo as well. Even Apple cannot ditch the old boy network. So there will be one day, there will be no plastic card in the world, but Visa and Master, its infrastructure will continue to hum to make payment easy around the world. The only major competitor from that perspective for Visa and Master is in fact China's Union Pay, which is this monopoly credit card clearing company in China. So what did that Visa do to prepare itself? It had a joint venture with Alibaba right now. All right, so that is the sort of financial institution learning. And what we see is in this particular vertical, what we learn is it's so important to make sure your supply chain or your ecosystem is digitally connected with your partner. So these are 4 different types of organizational setup. Vertically integrated company, we all know what they are. You basically do everything in-house. And I'm focusing on these 3, which is more common. Static supply chain is like a traditional car company. You buy from component supplier, you integrate, you sell to consumer. Open market on the right-hand side is the traditional stuff that your end customer would just buy stuff in the market and do their use case by themselves. People would buy tea bags and then cup and saucers by themselves in different stores. Now, ecosystem is a buzzword today. Essentially, the clearer definition is customer can either buy from you or buy from the suppliers that sit on top of your platform. So people buy from Apple, or people buy stuff on third-party mobile game stuff on top of the iOS. The key here is that connectivities need to be digitally connected. The reason why Visa and MasterCard is so successful is the easy plug-and-play API. So here's the question for us to reflect on. We also need to scale up our ecosystem. And in your ecosystem interface, how much it is digital, how much this is manual. When I spoke to executives in the Western world, particularly in Europe, they all said they have an ecosystem. But all of these collaboration is based on manual contract. And I'm sorry, this is not digital ecosystem. Unless you make it automatic and plug and play, otherwise your influence is way too slow. So this is a difficult conversation one has to also embrace. But if you hear about what I've been speaking so far, it's also about the idea how you can thrive over the long run. Because it's not enough to succeed in the next quarter. It's not enough just to succeed in the next 5 years. But if we were to try to prosper over decades or over centuries, from time to time, organizations do need to leap to the next knowledge frontier. For car makers, it's moving away from mechanical engineering based on internal combustion engine to self-driving car to electric vehicle. For banking institute, it's from the historic managing human relations, like in a retail branch, to robo-advisory to AI. And so if you're interested about these findings, simply Google for all the other report, Knowing Doing Gap Howard U, and you can get all kinds of publicly available report, both from the other vertical as well. There are consumer packaged goods, all the ways to global logistics as well. We keep churning the report, and you get access to the database if you're interested around that. But let me back it out a little bit about the key lesson learned here. The reason I'm obsessed with this question of a knowing-doing gap is what I have observed across industry and era. There's always the latecomer that will surpass pioneering company. So you take from personal computer all the way to wind turbine, the pioneering company historically are all Western companies. Today, all these sectors are dominated by latecomer, usually from Asia. Then the key question is, what can you do about it if this is such an inexorable dilemma for innovator? The key question that I find out, or the key finding, is you need to leap to the next knowledge frontier. Let me explain a little bit. In Switzerland, it's fortunately that we had an industry that has settled down in a city called Basel for more than 200 years. They never get disrupted by any latecomer, which is very strange because Detroit get decimated by the Japanese, then the South Korean, today is threatened by Tata Motors and BYD from China. In Switzerland, there's a cluster of companies have settled down along River Rhine in city of Basel for more than 2 decades, 2 centuries. And that industry is the global pharmaceutical industry. Novartis and Roche, they're making huge amount of money. Basel is not Detroit. They are enjoying the wealthiest standard of living in the Western Europe. But what happened inside Basel is the following. All these pharmaceutical companies, historically, they invent new drugs based on organic chemistry. In fact, all these pharmaceutical firms, once upon a time, they were chemical dye manufacturer working for the textile sector. So happens some chemists discover medicinal benefit in their compound. Now don't ask me why, how they know that. Maybe they taste it by accident, but they know there are medicinal benefit from the chemical compound. Then around the 20s, you remember Alexander Fleming discovered the first antibiotics, the penicillin. The entire Basel industry moved to the next knowledge frontier, microbiology. And then today, if you ask any pharmaceutical firm how they discover new drugs, of course, it's all about bioinformatics and genomics. It's the study of DNA. What you see in this story of pharmaceutical industry, the fact that they are able to thrive over 2 centuries is they leap across knowledge frontier. Had they stuck with one single discipline, they would forever be only a low-cost competitor. From this lens, auto sector makes sense because historically it's all about mechanical engineering. Today, it's leaping to the next knowledge frontier. So one last question that I would encourage to contemplate about, and then I'll take some question as well, is that is your company innovation project built on new knowledge and new capability, or merely exploiting the existing knowledge domain to do something incremental? In the banking sector, one can think about coming up with a new financial product based on what you know. Or one can think about a new business model based on AI and new knowledge frontier. That is the critical question that senior executive must confront themselves. With that, I'm going to open up a couple of questions I was told before, but thank you very much.
First of all, thank you. Very insightful presentation. Appreciate the research about the industry. I am from the financial services sector, work for American Express. I mean, you spoke about all the fintech companies, and you spoke especially about MasterCard and Visa. I know you didn't mention American Express. They have a closed-loop model. What are your views of American Express, and what are the strengths the company brings?
That's great. I need to be careful when industry insiders challenging or asking me a question, but thank you for bringing this up. American Express, a few years back, they were very, very successful in their digital strategy. It was when the industry begins to feel this whole digital thing can affect the financial sector, and American Express really did a massive job in getting new customers to sign up. And yet, I think the idea here is, at the industry evolution at its early phase, closed-loop system works best. Once the industry mature in digital, then the open system works better. It's the whole old saying, when iPhone first launched, it needs to be completely closed, but in terms of number of user adoption, Android surpassed as a later stage. So I think American Express was on a crossroad. Historically, we are closed. We deliver this unparalleled user experience. But as time matures, being closed does involve a trade-off that open system allow easier plug and play. As a result, the market share becomes bigger. The critical question for executives then to ask themselves becomes, going forward, is market share the determined factor in order to win because of monopolistic type of dynamic of an industry, or we can stay small and beautiful? And that is really up to the leadership team to make that tough choices. But thank you so much for bringing that up. That's a really interesting question.
I'll take the next question. Out here. I too come from a financial industries background. By the way, inspirational stuff, the keep learning hashtag is not just for individuals, but also for corporations. So that underlying theme of keep learning was very evident out there. So that was a good learning. In terms of when you talked about Kodak and you apply the analogy of how BMW also needs to step up, Kodak was more of mass production, a mass market. BMW, at least in my opinion, it's more a niche market, right?
That's right.
So how do you apply that? The comparison doesn't fall out. So does BMW really need to go to the next knowledge frontier, or is because it's niche, can it just continue doing that? Your opinion on that, please.
Right, and this is a really horrendous scenario for a premium provider to confront it with. Because if the world is really moving away from car ownership to share mobility as a service, probably charged by mileages and monthly rate, etc., that means that the whole proposition of the ultimate driving machine doesn't really work. And more damagingly for BMW or even Daimler or Ferrari, for instance, if people no longer driving their own car, then the sense of freedom is not really geared towards how you build the car itself, but is the self-driving car capability that deliver that experience. So my sense is, given the industry is gonna go consolidate, becoming small and beautiful is becoming harder and harder to achieve. Every time when an industry going through consolidation, there's no room for small and beautiful. You're looking at personal computer, right? There used to be 20, 30 different brands, and now it comes down to 4 or 5. You look at home appliances, there used to be dozens of different brands. Today is Samsung, Haier, and a couple of guys. Mobile phones, same thing. But a lot of brand needs to wrestle with. Thank you so much for the question.
Thank you so much, Howard.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you.